There's a lot of kids out there who need your help, and a donation to St. Jude could potentially save them. Link to my fundraiser is in the description.
Colossal! Not done yet!
Vespa, I couldn't.
For those who would like a refresh, last year I took a look at the main 3 games in the Azure Striker Gunvolt series, which served as Inti Creates' self-publishing debut. Before, they were a studio who would largely be commissioned by larger companies for specific games, with the 2 most notable ones being Namco and Capcom. But they later used that experience, particularly what they learned from making Mega Man titles, and developed their own IP. The original Azure Striker Gunvolt had a little bit of that first game syndrome and a rather tiresome endgame, but it still managed to be a fun experience, taking some ideas from Mega Man, specifically the X and the Zero series, and adding in some new things to form its own identity. The game overall got a sizable following to see both the PC port and an anime in 2015. Was that any good? And in 2016, a full-fledged sequel. Gunvolt 2 took a similar approach to the gameplay, but it feels like the devs refined what they did well, and almost completely got rid of what they didn't. The additions to GV made him even more of a joy to control, the levels were far more interesting, and Copen was a wonderful addition as a playable character. And Inti caught on to how much people really enjoyed him, because in May of 2018, almost 2 years after Gunvolt 2 came out, they would announce that Copen was getting his own game, Gunvolt Chronicles Luminous Avenger X. This seemed like a very logical thing to do, given how the events of Gunvolt 2 transpired, and the direction Gunvolt 3 would be taking. But still, seeing an entire game based around Copen was really neat. Not to mention, even if this was a subseries, this was the first time Gunvolt games debuted on consoles first. And I mean debuted on consoles, not on a handheld system before receiving console support like the last 2. I in particular was a fan of the series at that time, with being able to get Gunvolt 2 back when it came out on the 3DS, so I was generally hopeful. And with each passing trailer, I was convinced that the game would be more of the action that I loved. So, how did it turn out? And what became of the idea afterwards? Let's find out. So when the game came out, I got it around launch and I definitely enjoyed myself with what there was. But at the same time, there wasn't as much for me to really devote more time into it, or replay it as much compared to the last entry. There were a lot of parts of the game that just felt lesser and just not as interesting, but I can't say the game didn't deliver what it promised. With revisits though, my thoughts on it have kind of stagnated. I definitely had fun with what Gunvolt games do best, the stages and the bosses, but everything else surrounding it is just undercooked and not very interesting. This was a pretty hard script to write, because it's a game you theoretically could sum up and recommend in about a few minutes tops. But I will try to look a bit more into this and sum these feelings up. So the setup for the game is that Sumeragi, an organization that was previously experimenting with and even torturing adepts, who are basically humans with some kind of superpower in case you'd like a quick catch-up, is now outright forming legions of them and eradicating humans, or Minos as they're now called to signify that adepts are more common now. They're able to find any stragglers using their new project known as the Butterfly Effect. But among the Minos is a hero they call Ix, the Luminous Avenger, who is actually the returning Copen. During one of his run-ins with a group of soldiers from Sumeragi, including an adept that can control lightning by the name of Blade, Copen's quickly backed into a corner, but is assisted by a small group of Minos, who are just 3 kids that we basically learn nothing about, and Kohaku. And from there, the story takes a massive backseat until the end. And I would be fine with this if the characters were genuinely interesting, but I'm sorry, aside from Copen and maybe Lola and Kohaku, I just do not care about these characters. I do think Copen being a little more mellowed out compared to the last game is refreshing, and I find it easier to buy since he genuinely wants to help people, aside from him getting vicious all the time. Lola and Kohaku have a few good moments, but not really a thing that resonated with me, but everyone else is just borderline secondary. They have their own personality quirks, but they are barely given a chance to shine, even in optional conversations you can view while inside the base. It's kind of amazing just how much Kohaku completely outclasses them in terms of actual involvement in the story, even more so than the extra Quinn members from Gunvolt 1, and bear in mind, I think Kohaku is just alright. Not a great sign. I find this very disappointing because with normal humans slowly becoming the minority on the planet and adepts taking over and growing in numbers, this could have been a really good opportunity to show just how bad things have gotten for them in general, or heck, maybe how they find enlightenment in their friendships or their own interests, like how the kid with glasses loves Lola. Yes, I know he has a name, but you're not going to remember it in a few minutes. I sure didn't. I know I shouldn't be expecting a whole lot considering these kinds of games never had super engaging narratives to begin with, but at least with the previous two, I do feel like they at least took advantage of what they were setting up and tried to give everything present a degree of impact. I don't get that from the story, which is a massive shame because of that premise and because of another reason I'll get into later. Not even the villains are that interesting. They genuinely have some great designs, especially in their armed forms, but again, it feels like they're just there to be bosses and not given enough for me to care about them. Although there are two I remember pretty well, and one is for an entirely dumb me reason. That happens to be this one, Isola. At first, she kind of was falling into the same category as the rest, but then when she goes into her armed form, she basically becomes Nico Yasuo from Love Live. And I mean literally. Seriously, look at these two side by side. It also doesn't help matters that her personality goes from very class president-y serious to complete goober just like that, and her special attack is called Wonderful Rush. I see what you did there, and I approve of the appreciation of that franchise. The second one is Blade. She's pretty much the rival of the game, but the fact that she does have a legitimate presence about her, and actually gains a little more impact later on, for a reason I'll get into a bit, does make her at least somewhat memorable. Now, to fully go into why the story didn't click with me requires that I go into endgame spoilers, so just in case you don't want the game ruined for you, skip to this time frame. I'll give you a few seconds. Alright then, just to get this out there really quickly, the big reason why I grew a liking towards Blade is because of what ultimately happens to her at the end. She's actually Kohaku's sister, who was believed to have perished prior, and was used by the main villain as a new candidate for the Azure Striker Septima. Now, it's pretty obvious that she's Kohaku's sister, they might as well have confirmed it earlier, but I do like how she does mellow out and play a part in saving the day at the end. And as for the rest of the climax, the location of the butterfly effect is eventually discovered, along with an AI who is using the program, Demerzol, who also did the aforementioned brainwashing to Blade. Wasting no time, Copen makes his way over to it and discovers that its entire machine made with the Muse Septima and the brain of Copen's little sister Metil. Admittedly, this was a very haunting moment, because wow, extracting the brain of a child and empowering it with something to mind control others? That's very disturbing, but in a way where it fits with the themes the series has presented. But it's also confusing because wasn't Metil living a happy life at the end of Gunvolt 2? And how did this suddenly happen with the Muse Septima? Well, the answer comes in not long afterwards, and also answers why Blade has the Azure Striker Septima, and why the main villain and the aforementioned AI Demerzol is actually the same one as the first game, Asimov. This game's story actually takes place after the bad ending of Gunvolt 1, meaning that Gunvolt and Jewel were killed by Asimov, and the good ending of Gunvolt 1 and the entirety of Gunvolt 2 never happened. But then that begs the question of how Copen's still here, and the answer is that he turned himself into a robot. So, he's basically a Terminator now. Now, I'm totally okay with the idea of this being an alternate continuity, but my issues with the band of kids from earlier, and not learning much how the world was impacted from that ending, from a deeper perspective, all revolve around this. The setup for the timeline makes sense, but the game doesn't do much with it. Thus, it kinda removes the general point of it being an alternate continuity to begin with. Keeping it as a twist is fine, but it doesn't feel like it was there for world building. It comes off as very insignificant detail, and when it presents the idea, the game just ends, which blows. There's really not much to work off of for both world and characters, and so the attempt doesn't feel as impactful as it really should. And that's the story's downfall in my eyes. It wants you to care about these details, and doesn't give you much reason to. And I generally feel sorry about that. So, if you skip the spoilers, there's moments I like, and I'm okay with the gameplay being more of a priority, but there's a lot I think the game wants me to care about, but everything feels so base layer that it ends up going nowhere. I want to feel something more out of all this, but I can't. Well, that story part lasted a little longer than I thought, so I'll just move on to presentation. Admittedly, the game doesn't look that much more graphically impressive than the Striker Pack on consoles, as Copen's sprites are largely recycled from the second game, and most of the other character sprites could theoretically look fine on the 3DS as well. But what it lacks in that area, I feel it makes up for in much flashier battle effects and overall cleaner UI. The latter feels like everything is shrunken down and spaced out just enough so you can see what's happening on screen. And some of the battle effects get incredibly stylish, and the upgrades to battle portraits or special attacks are great as well. I also appreciate the updated portraits for conversations. These are very nicely drawn, though it is unfortunate that most of the time, characters just stick with one emote, which I found incredibly distracting in Kohaku's case. Kohaku, you're being held at gunpoint. Why are you this cheerful? And why aren't you wearing more clothes? Yeah, I don't really like Kohaku's design, she looks weird. But despite that, most of the other character designs are top notch, especially the bosses. I already mentioned Isola, but other highlights for me easily go to this lady and this guy, both in their normal attire and their boss modes. These are really cool, and exactly the kind of stylish yet odd I expect from these games. I'm really happy that they managed to keep the frame rate at a stable 60 frames, as it does make the action look even more stylized, and I am glad that despite the apocalyptic setting, the game doesn't get that dull visually, though there are a couple areas that blend in more for me. Soundtrack, I sadly don't remember a ton of. Though for one more thing I'm not fond of presentation-wise, that also feeds into my lack of interest in these characters, the mid-stage dialogue is gone. I know in my last Gunvolt review, I said the dialogue boxes got a little too big, but they actually had the solution to just clean up the UI a little bit. Getting rid of them reduces the amount of potential character we could get from just about everyone. I mean, it's still technically in the game, but it's just a little complimenting you for combos, and it doesn't change for any stage. So I may have a couple issues, but only one feeds into an issue for a different section, and the rest aren't exactly deal breakers. They're just noticeable. So with Inti wanting to give us more game, what do we have here? Well, I'm glad to say that if you enjoyed Copen in the last game, you'll like him now. Again, for those who want to refresh, Copen's main attack is a gun that can shoot sort of like a Mega Buster, but the depth of his playstyle lies within how he tags enemies. He has a dash that he can use on the ground or in the air, and if he hits an applicable target, he'll lock onto it, and once he does, he can unload several shots that can deal out a lot of damage. He can dash into walls to get the momentum going, hover after being in the air for long enough, and use a special attack which covers the whole screen. The bullets he has dictates how many times he can air dash or use privation to be immune to enemy attacks, and those can be reloaded at any time, with that also doubling as a ground stomp if he's in the air. For differences, the hover can last as long as you want now. I didn't have trouble with how long it lasted before, but it's good to see it get buffed. But one of the bigger changes is with privation. Not in terms of what it does, but rather the consequences of using it. Before, it only drained 1 bullet, but now it drains 2. So if you become too reliant on it, it becomes easier for that urge to bite you. I personally never minded it, but I know it became more of a contentious mechanic, so I'm totally okay with there being a bigger consequence for using it. Also, like before, after beating a boss, you gain special weapons themed after them, and I think they're really fun to use as well. Okay, more so the first 3 you get, as the last 3 really aren't that great comparatively. I like the Rising Cyclone perfectly fine, but Muse's Kiss feels like a downgrade to weapons Copen already has, and the Shroud Spear is basically a key to access some goodies. I don't use it that much for combat, because once it works, you can't attack that enemy, so I might as well use it for something else. I began to really like the Anchor Nexus more, since you're dashing all over the place, and weaponizing it is useful for enemies in awkward places. The Photon Detonator is a grenade launcher with huge range, and I think that speaks for itself. But my favorite is easily the Orbital Edge. It makes a great attack that circles around you, and it centers on the enemy to shred them if you lock on. That's really useful. Also, like last time, you can upgrade Copen to make the journey a little easier or harder if you want to, which includes being able to turn Privation and Anthem off, but the way it's handled here is completely different. Instead of getting materials needed to craft the upgrade, you now just buy them with money. I personally don't mind this change, as it trims down a lot of the fat I thought material collecting had last time, and makes it into a single step, which I like. But at the same time, the fact that you can only find money from defeated enemies and in places off the beaten path, and most upgrades have ridiculous prices, means that it's no less grindy in nature. I get that grinding may be inevitable in a lot of these kinds of cases, but I think it would have helped if money was given to you after beating a stage, with the amount going up if you managed to get a higher rank. I personally would prefer this method to be more grindy, as opposed to be grindy and luck-based, and I do prefer buying the upgrades outright. But I do think this could have used a little more tuning, on top of maybe a little more variety in the upgrades themselves, since I found that kind of lacking. But there is one more thing added in: Darkness Trigger. After a certain point in the story, Copen will gain access to this, and when activated, Lolo will basically turn into a Sacrilege, seriously, luck, and you'll gain unlimited use of your special weapons, and you generally do more damage, but you constantly take damage every second you're not attacking or dashing. This is not needed to beat the game, and this does not unlock anything else. It's only there if you want a new way to speedrun, but I think this is really fun, and allows for a good means to replay a stage in a different way. The risk being you'll die if you don't get aggressive, or you take down enemies in a bad order, but the reward arguably being some of the most destructive and fun gameplay yet. It's difficult to get the hang of, but once you do, man, it feels good. Though, just looking at the levels through normal Copen's perspective, I think the level design gets the job done, but not much else. I appreciate with them not getting overly spacious and incentivize trying to dash all over the place, but there aren't as many set pieces to really make them that interesting. It's cool that some of the places from Gunvolt 1 got revisioned, but aside from that, I don't have much to say. They're just fine. but I think a lot of the gameplay comes together in this game's boss encounters. This isn't my favorite collection, but I do think each one is very fun to fight, and probably subverts a few expectations naturally, namely with some attacks going through your probation. There's only two problems I have with them. I feel a lot of the challenge with them comes from the fact that Copen isn't very durable this time. I'm fine with the probation nerf, but you don't have that much HP, and considering some attacks can be very hard to dodge, some bosses might unexpectedly surprise you, especially on your first playthrough. Copen also can't heal anymore. Only checkpoints, items, and expensive upgrade are the only things that can, so in boss fights, you need to be more careful. Or you could just use their weakness weapons. I understand that in Gunvolt 2, and almost every Mega Man and Mega Man-like game, weaknesses are easy ways around. You know, you discover their weakness, so you make them weak. But even by that standard, while I wouldn't consider these bosses that hard without their weaknesses, with their weaknesses, I feel the difficulty drop is so far that it basically shatters. Except for this one, who I think is actually harder with her weakness, the Anchor Nexus, than without. Either the boss crumbles so fast that even Gary from last time would be given weird looks, or they have a bad case of Spark Mandrill syndrome. I'm good at this game! Now, I'm not necessarily bothered when a game is really short, as long as I had a good time playing it and all that, and I did have fun for what the game offered, but to be frank, the reason why I'm a little bummed that I don't remember a bunch of the levels was because I feel like for the game's length, I felt a little unfulfilled. It didn't have the most of the interesting stuff was at the end, but on top of that, with the levels in general being shortened to the point, and the bosses crumbling with their weaknesses, I could kind of feel the game just going by with little impact. And the final time for my main playthrough, which covered every main stage and boss with 2 stage replays, was approximately 2 hours. I'm fine with no multiple endings, but still, all that in about 2 hours, plus a couple of truncated versions of the same stages, is all that this game has. Yeah. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I dislike this game. I found myself enjoying the stages and the bosses with all Copen could do, implying it wasn't breaking the ladder, and it overall did what it promised. So overall, I'd say I like it, but when I think about it more, the more I truly come to grips with why I don't go back to it, and most of the stuff I do like was done just as good, if not better, in Gunvolt 2. So in the end, I'd rather just play that instead. I am sorry if I kept on bringing up past games as a point of comparison, but aside from a few things, this game just doesn't give me much to go off of. It's a totally fine game at the end of it all, and I'd say I like it more than Gunvolt 1, as I like playing as Copen more, and the game doesn't have any bosses that I hated fighting, or dumb means to pad out the game, but I will say that this one is probably the least memorable. It's a game that's cool and exists, and I definitely recommend it if you liked Copen and Gunvolt 2, but I feel like for the start of an alternate continuity, it should be a lot more. But hey, since they have the idea in motion, maybe they could truly do more within the sequel. Think of the different directions, the world building, the means to spice up the gameplay, okay. I was also really hyped for the amount of games 2022 was going to give us, because just within January, there were 3 releases I was looking forward to. Pokemon Legends Arceus, which you probably know my thoughts on by now, Kojin Sword of Rewind, which I still have yet to play, but I hear it's good, and finally, Gunvolt Chronicles Luminous Avenger X2. Despite how mixed I came across when looking at X1 earlier, the fact that I still had fun regardless, and I liked what came before it, was enough to get me excited for this one. Sure, announcing it when not a whole lot was known about Gunvolt 3, which was announced before this was a little weird, but I really didn't care. And then I got it... Okay, to be honest with you all, when I first played this game, I was completely disappointed. The amount of changes the game made to the core gameplay and just everything surrounding it from level design to boss design really just did not click with me. The game didn't annoy me, with the exception of 2 boss fights, but throughout my playtime back then, I was completely apathetic to what I was going through, and after I finished the main campaign, I quickly put the game down and went back to playing Legends Arceus. However, as I was thinking of the idea to look at the main Gunvolt trilogy around Gunvolt 3's launch, I thought about giving this game another chance whenever I decided to do this very video. Mega Man S games usually tended to be more fun, unrepeated playthroughs for me, so I thought I might see something I didn't earlier. And I guess this is where we get into that. But I can assure you, it certainly won't be with the story, because... what story is there? So the main thread of the last game was dealt with, and Blade now leads the world. And... Copen and Kohaku are seen in a relatively nice looking apartment. Okay, not doing much with the apocalyptic setting I see. Also, hi Blaster Master Zero Easter egg, and then they're taken into another world. Oh, I guess we're doing the whole thing where they have to get home. So, you know my issue with the first game's story, trying to get me to care about certain things, but barely giving me anything to do so, thus making most of the important stuff far less impactful? Well, it's unfortunately worse here. The fact that this game takes place in a world we basically know nothing about, aside from the fact that humans are extinct, and it's only a desert with a giant tower called the Grave Pillar, means absolutely nothing, aside from the excuse to have tons of level archetypes. I would be fine with this, but not only is this coming off games that legit tried at world building and character growth to varying degrees of quality, but they try to get you to care about the new face Null, as well as to a degree the main antagonist. I would go more into the latter, but honestly I could just tell you that the reasoning feels so tacked on and out of nowhere for what this timeline was building up to, that it's difficult to care. So there's basically no point. Copen is just going through the motions, Kohaku is just there, and each one of the Gravekeepers, your bosses, are just that, bosses to fight. But Null in particular, they do give her more to work with, but they forgot to actually make her interesting. She was meant to work for the main villain, but had an error in her programming that considered her a defect. That's an okay idea, but the idea is all we get. In fact, this game is just a lot of ideas that just remained ideas, with other things that focused on the game aspect, which I would be fine with, except there's quite a few times where the game suddenly wants you to feel tense or emotional when certain things happen, but there's also a scene near the end of the game where Null sacrifices herself to become a teleporter after the previous one was destroyed. I'm sorry, but this scene just rang so hollow to me. Null was mostly in the background, primarily giving exposition, with barely any character growth, and the fact that she's considered a defect is just brought up like it was on a checklist, so this sudden dark moment barely feels earned. In fact, this entire plot just rang hollow. To me, this story is nothing more than ideas thrown at you with no real cohesion, and moments that try to resonate with you, but don't have anything for them to do so. I'm usually okay with there being no story in these kinds of games, but at least every game prior stayed focused and only tried to be heavy when it was needed. I straight up don't know what the writing was going for, so I have to ask, why should I care? Because these are the good guys? Well, I'm sorry, but I need more if you're going to do that. As is, I don't feel like I'm gaining anything experiencing it, let alone summarizing it. This plot, at the end of the day, is completely inconsequential. You're not missing anything by not paying attention to it, and I think I can get away with saying that you're not missing anything by not paying attention to this game as a whole. Structurally, the game isn't that much different from previously. Go through a set of stages and beat all the bosses located within, and then go through a series of stages that include boss rematches and beat the bad guy at the end. But it's how Copen does it this time that was the deal breaker for me. So Copen this time is rocking a buzzsaw weapon, so right off the bat, the game will be at least different. He's basically a melee character who can air dash like before, spring off walls to keep it going, and hover as per usual. But let's talk about that buzzsaw. You can only stick it out in place and do continuous damage that goes down slowly, which is the only thing you can do with it while in the air, and you can do a 3-hit combo. And as for melee combat, that's basically it. There really isn't anything considered a dash attack for it, unless you count that shoulder tackle that forces enemies back while sticking it out, which I don't. You can't charge it, and you can only do the combo while standing still. I don't like this thing. The first strike deals so little damage that it rarely becomes useful, which really becomes a problem when you're stuck in the air, and doing the combo a lot causes you to stay still, which slows down the game a ton. Copen can also no longer lock onto enemies by ground dashing into them. All he'll do is push them back, which might be useful depending on if there's a pit around, but most of the time it just inconveniences you more, since you can't do anything to follow up on it, at least by default. But despite that, and despite the fact that the gun is gone, Copen can still lock onto enemies using his air dash and shoot out tons of buzzsaws that deal a lot of damage. And this is actually a far more reliable way of dealing damage to everything. Inti, you do realize this completely defeats the purpose of making him a melee character, right? Oh, and while the air dash itself functions totally fine, there's one decision made with it that's also very questionable. You can only do one. Once you use an air dash, you have to land on the ground for it to recharge. And the way this also wrecks the pacing hits you as early as the first stage. Lines of enemies which used to flow naturally into combos are now slowed down immensely, and it leaves you feeling terribly confused. Not helped by the fact that Copen can't ground stomp anymore. That would have helped for damage and flow more, so I really cannot think of a reason why they would remove that. Also, the bullet system is completely gone. I'm fine with this meaning no privation, but it causing the air dash to take a hit was one step too far. Darkness Trigger is gone as well. Lola just goes into that form for Copen's screen nuke and nothing else. So even score attacking is far more one note. And the thing is, multi-air dashing is still a thing, but you need to get 1000 kudos or Anthem in order to do it. Now granted, kudos are a little easier to get now. You can get hit as many times as you want and you won't lose them. You only will if you hit a checkpoint, die, or heal. But I'm not really a fan of this either. I can see what they were trying to go for with this, but I feel like this game took it way too far by making Copen far more limited than he's ever been, and also not capping the healing with a cooldown meter. So if you don't care about getting the best ranks, heal to your heart's content. I usually have no issue with kudos being the ticket to greater rewards, but I feel like those should be for those who actually want to get better and score higher. I've been a very casual Gunvolt fan from the very start, and the only reason I wanted to do better in both Gunvolt 2 and 3 was because controlling every character felt really good, and I enjoyed learning what they could do with them. I played Buried the Light back in the other video for a reason. I get almost none of that here. I feel like I'm just crawling through stages wanting to do cool things and go fast, but I can't. It feels like in terms of how Copen controls now, they wanted to commit to a new playstyle, but at the same time not, leading to a massive hodgepodge that hurts the experience. It doesn't help that locking on by ground dashing, and the only extra thing the combo can get, that being Copen launching the last strike like a projectile, are all upgrades that you need to buy. I think they might have been scrambling for some upgrade ideas. Now, to get a little more positive here for a minute, the special weapons aren't too bad, except the Doomsday Charge. Takes way too long to charge for my liking. And because of the singular air dash, I don't enjoy the Anchor Nexus as much this time. Also not too big on the Cryo Flash, unless it was a segment where Copen's being chased by something. But the Whirling Chopper is handy as an extra jump, and does a lot of damage. The Gatling Blitz and the Rolling Ripper were really solid in bringing the pain, and the latter can fetch certain items, and you'd be surprised how strong the Optic Barrier can be, though I wish it was more consistent with what projectiles it can block. I also think the level design is actually better than I thought, if we're talking just about the pure design. There's a lot more gimmicks to make each stage all its own, and it feels like they have much more of an identity compared to X1. Like the Space Block has some low gravity that makes for some admittedly decently fun platforming, and the Arctic Block, while it does have some annoying ways of managing the ice physics, does have this neat time trial part that can go up depending on how big the fireball you launched into the furnace was. Though I swear, the Volcano Block reminds me a little too much of Flame Stag's level from Mega Man X2, and the Jungle Block is just straight up whipped by our stage from Mega Man X4. Sadly, Copen's playstyle and things not being fully fixed through the upgrades get in the way of my appreciation for them. But even when accounting for the core playstyle, I'd still say that this is the weakest set of bosses. Most are outright dull, but a select number of them push that boundary and just become annoying. Vespa starts out bland, but the last part is bottomless pits on the edge of the arena. I never really liked when bosses do this, because it's not great for the way I think, and most of the time, the pits are more of a threat than the boss itself. Same goes for Autochrome, where there's one in the center. He's always moving, so it's difficult to account for him and the pit, but with how he attacks and with how air dashing works, sometimes the sprites get messy, and yeah. And Hail is one of the worst fights in the series. Most of her attacks freeze you, which you constantly need to mash out like you got your seal broken in Smash Brothers. She litters the field with other projectiles, making mobility a mess, and her weakness is the Doomsday Charge, which takes too long to charge, and the smaller shots that you can spam guzzle down ammo faster than Kirby guzzles down his lunch, and don't do enough damage worth much. And if your shot is not fully charged, her attacks might just cancel it out. Yay! But to be fair again, I do like how the boss rush does something different with half of these. Brigade's fight is an expanded version of his initial final phase, and Vespa and Autochrome actually team up to fight you. It's not necessarily the level or boss design that's really the reason for why I don't like this game. It's how much this game clearly stripped away from the previous entries, and left the player with far less options for the experience, on top of them asking you to play it like someone who does take these kinds of games seriously, and go for the highest score. Playing the game super competitively and going for a high score should not be a thing forced onto every consumer out there. It should be something the consumer should want to do based on how much the core gameplay clicked with them. Even if the other games were heavily pushing score, it felt like there was at least something there for those who just want to have a good time and not care about the ranking system. The other games did that in a way where they look out for both casual and competitive crowds, while this one tries way too hard to appeal to the latter. It's for these reasons why I honestly got really bored while playing this game, and I wanted to put it down and go play something else. This all got further amplified once I unlocked hard mode, which you do by getting all the bonus emblems. Now, bonus emblems were in X1, but they were there for a Kudos edition and bragging rights. Here, they unlock a harder difficulty, and by that I mean harder versions of these bosses. I really didn't think the levels were that much harder, not even with how they hold you back more. The reason as to why this hard mode has become infamous is because you reset back to level 1 and cannot gain experience, meaning no more health beyond your default amount, you cannot use any upgrades you purchased in your main file, and you can't heal. Bonus emblems and Anthem are also gone, and if you take a hit, you lose all your kudos, meaning that you have better luck winning the lottery than trying to get multi-dashing here. Copen also has lives now, which... no! I would not pay hard mode much mind, but the thing is, the true ending of the game is locked behind this. No! Though I don't get the effort of making it a true ending, because all that really changes is that you get to resurrect Null, and she gets to go home with you. Okay, I mean, that's not like Copen and Kohaku make it home anyways, in an ending shot that is almost just like the one from the last game. But do you want to know something funnier about this decision? In Update, they added a feature in hard mode that re-enables healing and gives you 200 lives. Yeah, that was a bad idea that they tried to soften the blow for, so let's talk about presentation. Graphically, I think the game is a step up, with more detailed sprites and a great variety of colors for each stage that all pop in some form. There's tons of great effects for attacks, and the special portraits are now fully animated, which is very refreshing. That said, not a fan of these character designs. I think Copen's new armor is a little too bulky for my liking, and most of the bosses aren't as interesting, with a select few looking like they came from Mighty No. 9, which Inti had a hand in and was also apparently an inspiration for some of them. Music I don't think is amazing, but it has grown on me a little bit, especially when I began to listen to it on its own. It's nothing really crazy, but it at least sticks. But perhaps the biggest upgrade was the fact that this was actually the first Gunvolt game to have an English dub. Even if mid-stage dialogue isn't a thing here, aside from Lola cheering you on, it is really cool to see them get a new cast for this. The acting itself is mostly hit or miss, but I do appreciate the effort, and there are some really funny choices here. There's a boss character in this game voiced by, of all people, Egoraptor. That's pretty cool. Also, with Lola being voiced by Cassandra Lee Morris, I keep on expecting her to tell Copen to go to sleep. Hey, I'm trying to bring enlightenment to this part of the review because when I get to a point where I'd rather just look up any story differences from hard mode rather than just continue to play hard mode, I think that speaks volumes for how bored and bummed I feel. I'm gonna be honest here. I did not have fun with Luminous Avenger X2. There are things I like about it, but the changes Inti made were in the wrong places, not really addressing any sort of issues, and inadvertently creating new ones altogether. And it got to a point where I got every bonus emblem in unlocked hard mode, just so I could have some footage for it for this video, out of obligation. And I only played 2 stages in hard mode because aside from seeing the upgraded bosses, what do I have to look forward to? Nothing. I knew a free multi-air dash would alleviate everything, and further defeat the point of making Copen a melee character, but I like to think about how much more fun the game would have been if you could do that, and if I would have liked it more. Apparently, that thought crossed Inti's minds, because you can get exactly that if you pay actual money for one of the DLC guest bosses and then beat it. Inti. No. Something that is very reminiscent of a previous mechanic, and something that would have made the game at least better, is behind a paywall. I've heard of inconveniencing the consumer, but inconveniencing the consumer after they paid way more than what the previous games were worth? What good comes from that? I mean, I'm not going to say anything about these guest bosses themselves, aside from how much they cost compared to the other DLC Inti's done, but yeah, no, I'm done with this game. Now, I'm willing to give Inti the benefit of the doubt, since Gunvolt 3 has approached DLC much better, by not only balancing the core game for the most part, but almost everything afterwards was provided in a free update, and whatever wasn't was just collectibles that were free when they were new, but only cost $2 later. So I'm willing to bet they realized a lot of bad ideas went into this, and are trying to make up for it, which I'm at least grateful for. However, I'm not going to forget this, lest they try something like this again. X2 may not be absolutely awful, or even that bad. It's more than playable, and I've certainly played and reviewed way worse games, but I have absolutely no desire to return to it. Not helped by Gunvolt 3 doing everything it tried to do, from melee combat to different difficulties giving more content, far better. And with that, Luminous Avenger X2 has nothing left to show. I do not recommend this game, even if you are curious. It's kind of a shame that I'm ending my visit through every game in the Gunvolt series with a negative look on Luminous Avenger X2, but I guess that's just how things go sometimes. As a whole, this subseries is leaving a lot to be desired. It has great ideas, and I find with this being a haven for Copen's gameplay style from Gunvolt 2 to continue, but something needs to be done to freshen things up. As it stands now, I'll be optimistic for Luminous Avenger 3, but I sincerely hope Inti learns from this and what was done well prior, and go even further. They already seem like they want to make a branching franchise from this, and I'm down to see what characters they want to focus on, but all they ask is for each game to get the time they deserve, and commit to any similarities or differences that they want to do. If I were to rank all 5 games from favorite to least favorite, Gunvolt 3 is my favorite for how much of a joyride it is, and for executing abstract concepts well, Gunvolt 2 for how much of an improvement it was, and then X1 because I like Copen's initial playstyle, and then Gunvolt 1 because while I can't think of too many higher highs than X1, and I can certainly recall some lower lows, I do think it is more memorable for better or worse. I kind of flip-flop between those two, but I'm feeling X1 a bit more. And then, X2 at dead last. The game left me completely bored and disappointed. The only one I don't think is worth your time. But I still stand by what I said in my initial Gunvolt video for recommending this series. Try it out if you're curious, and I hope you have as much fun as I did with all the good stuff. Before I wrap things up for today, I want to give a quick shout out to everyone who has donated to my St. Jude Play Life campaign so far. It means a lot to me, and I'm sure that money will potentially save a child's life. But starting now, in every countdown review, I'll be sure to give those who have donated $15 or more their vocal credits. So special thanks to Bubba Hyde and an anonymous donor for their respective donations. Both of you are awesome. I'm Lang Ripper, and thank you for watching.